Hello, these are flipped notes 8-6 of clinical psychology, and in this section we're talking all about schizophrenia. Let's get to it. Schizophrenia is a severe disorder that involves disordered thoughts, extreme emotions that have nothing to do with any particular situation, and very strange behavior. Pretty wide range of symptoms for this disorder. One of the main ones is psychosis. It's a symptom, not an illness, in which thoughts and emotions are so impaired that contact is lost with external reality. Schizophrenia is now considered to be on a spectrum to encompass the many and varying degrees of symptoms a person can have and still be identified as schizophrenic. There used to be several different types of schizophrenia, like catatonic, disorganized, paranoid schizophrenic, and they now just diagnose as schizophrenia with whatever symptoms that they may have. The schizophrenia spectrum disorder affects approximately 1 in 100 people in the general population, which amounts to about 24 million people throughout the world. If we're going to call depression the common cold of psychological disorders, you could say schizophrenia is the cancer in its severity. If schizophrenia runs in one's family, its odds increase to 1 in 10 for that person. Strikes young people as they mature into adults. So the symptoms start to show up right around the ages of 18 or 20. And a lot of that may have to do with that's when stress levels tend to increase the most. It affects men and women equally, but men seem to suffer from it more severely than women do. The literal translation for schizophrenia is split mind, and that's why it's often mixed up with multiple personality disorder. But this is definitely a verifiable disorder with empirical and biological evidence. With schizophrenia, there's a split from reality that shows itself in several ways. A couple of the hallmark symptoms are the delusions, the disorganized and delusional thinking, disturbed perceptions, or we would classify them as hallucinations, and inappropriate emotions and actions, especially for the current situations. For the disorganized thinking, they really just have scattered thoughts. I mean, of all the people who have schizophrenia, there's a wide range of different symptoms. Not everybody has delusions, not everybody has hallucinations, but almost everybody who has schizophrenia has the disorganized thinking, and that's one of the first things they notice. Psychologists think it's because of their selective attention failure, which is going on primarily up in the frontal lobe, and that results in fragmented, bizarre thoughts that spill out in no particular order. It's just very random. Other disorganized perceptions, they may perceive things that are not there. That's what a hallucination is, perception, and that can be auditory or visual. Inappropriate emotions for the situation. They might laugh when they hear news of someone dying or show no emotion at all, which is known as flat affect or apathy. Most of the symptoms of schizophrenia can be divided into two categories, positive or negative symptoms. Remember that positive doesn't mean good. In this case, it means an addition of something or adding to normal functions. So the positive symptoms usually are a distortion or excess of normal functions. They tend to show up more frequently in the earlier stages of schizophrenia, but there's an extra presence of inappropriate behavior, and that includes delusions, hallucinations, and disordered speech, or what we call word salad, along with the disorganized behavior. So the positive symptoms of delusions. So a delusion is a distorted or a false belief. And generally, there are of the two types. There are delusions of persecution and delusions of grandeur. Delusions of persecution, what it sounds like, they're being watched, they're being followed, somebody's after them, someone's out to get me. In grandeur, they believe there's something really important. I'm Superman, I'm a spy for the government, I am the president, but they think that there's something important. Hallucinations are when they have a perception that's not actually there. There's no corresponding sensation. So they're seeing things, hearing things, even possibly feeling things, smelling things. The most common, though, are auditory hallucinations. Word salad is one of the other positive symptoms, and that's disorganized speech. And it's a result of this disordered thoughts that lead to these jumbled words that seem to make no sense to the listener. That they'll start a sentence with one idea or thought, and by the time they've made it to the end of the sentence, it's not a connected thought because their thoughts are so scattered. The disorganized behavior, often that shows up as motor behaviors that are inappropriate, and we mean movement. They might be moving a lot, senseless, compulsive acts, like continually rubbing an arm or rocking in a chair, or it could actually be a total lack of movement. Our negative symptoms are behavioral deficits or the loss or decrease of normal functions. So with positive, it was extra symptoms, extra functioning. Here it's a loss of or missing or subtracting normal functions. So an absence of appropriate behavior. That includes flat affect, where they're avoiding eye contact, a very expressionless face, apathy, and just no interest in anything, a very monotone voice. Poverty of speech, just long lapses of not talking and slowed speech, and a lack of directness, slowed movements, little interest in social participation. The way that schizophrenia may show up can be described as chronic or acute. When it is slow to develop, we call it chronic or process schizophrenia. And with those, recovery seems more often to be less likely. They usually develop more negative symptoms, and they're just a lot harder to treat and go away. But when it shows up more rapidly, we call that acute or reactive schizophrenia, or reactive symptoms or acute symptoms. And for some reason, those seem to recover a little bit better, and those tend to be more of the positive symptoms. Other common symptoms that don't necessarily fit into the positive or negative categories: paranoia, a preoccupation with delusions and hallucinations, often with themes of persecution or grandiosity. So those do fall under positive, but it's just an overwhelming amount of paranoia. And then catatonic behaviors, and that can involve immobility, where they are not moving at all. They often sometimes have a sort of wax-like flexibility where they'll just like hold different positions for a long amount of time. Sometimes extreme negativity, a parrot-like repeating of another's speech, so they'll just copy what others are saying and doing. Childhood schizophrenia is basically the same as regular schizophrenia, but it starts during childhood, which is much more rare, only about 1 in 10,000 in the population. It's more common in males. There's still the psychosis, the loss of touch with reality, hallucinations, delusions, irrational behavior and thinking, and it definitely affects their functioning with daily tasks. Simple things like bathing, attending school would be difficult, any of that because of the scattered thoughts. As far as where does schizophrenia come from, it is a disease of the brain that shows up as symptoms in the mind. So we do see brain abnormalities. The dopamine hypothesis finds that dopamine is overactive in those who are schizophrenic, and that they seem to have higher levels of dopamine receptors in the brain. Remember that dopamine, in general, can control movement. We've talked about low levels of dopamine being connected to Parkinson's disease. And in general, it makes you feel good, but too much of it can lead to risky behaviors. And then a lot of it, in this case, we're seeing can show up as hallucinations and delusions. As far as the actual physical brain, there seems to be abnormal activity in the frontal cortex. We know that that's where decision making and thought processing happens. In the thalamus, and the thalamus is what's sending information to different sensory parts of the brain, and then in the amygdala. Also, adolescent schizophrenics seem to show brain lesions, so actual like tissue loss in adolescent brains. The brain seems to change, some morphology, that schizophrenic patients have an enlargement of the ventricles in their brain. So that doesn't seem to be a cause, but more just seems to be a side effect. On the right here, you can see these larger dark areas, and those are smaller in a well twin who doesn't have schizophrenia. So that just means less overall brain tissue there. Other details about the brain, what's going on with the brain in schizophrenia: low activity in the frontal lobes. Hallucinations are connected to too much activity in the thalamus. The greater the shrinkage of the hippocampus and the amygdala, the worse the disorder seems to show up. And if the thalamus is small, the greater difficulty in filtering information and possibly reacting in the correct manner. So why do all these brain abnormalities occur? What's causing the actual brain abnormality? Some theories are that it's due to prenatal problems, low birth weights, complications during birth, primarily due to lack of oxygen, or that there are problems with the mother during pregnancy. Sometimes paradogens, specifically viruses, including the influenza or the flu, during the middle of fetal development. Definitely know that genetic factors are involved, with the prevalence going way up when a person has it already in their family. Some of the early warning signs of schizophrenia include a mother's long lasting. If a mother has schizophrenia, definitely more likely there. Birth complications, short attention span, poor muscle coordination, disruptive and withdrawn behavior, emotional unpredictability, poor peer relations. Studies found that if one identical twin had schizophrenia, it was a 50% chance that the other one would have it as well. Family experiences and interactions. Just having trauma or a bad experience during childhood alone is not enough to cause schizophrenia. But being in a pathogenic or an unhealthy environment where there's high expressed emotions can bring out the disorder if the person already has the genes for it. And this is described in the diathesis stress hypothesis that says even though a person may have the inherited predisposition towards schizophrenia, the symptoms might not ever show up. But if they're exposed to certain environmental stressors, then it's more likely to show up. Unfortunately, very often, those who are schizophrenic have schizophrenia in their family already, and that does create a stressful home environment. But suppressing those stressors can seem to limit some of the symptoms. Here's the model again, the diathesis stress model. If you've got that predisposition of vulnerability, plus the environmental stressors, including prenatal trauma, childhood abuse, family conflict, significant life changes, and that's often why it shows up there in the late teens, early 20s, can lead to the disorder. And the stronger the genetics, the less stress that's needed to produce the disorder. All right, that's it for Flipped Notes 8-6 on schizophrenia.